Thanks so much, Jesse.
Ready. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. So Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, we promote open data and open tools to support mapping across humanitarian and development contexts. That's kind of just our nutshell of a background. For this project, we wanted to have a deeper understanding of data readiness for when events happen. A lot of times, if there is a data gap, we identify it after something has happened, and then we are rushing to fill it. And many times, while that data is still useful, it's not useful for the purposes that it would have been at the beginning. So through this project, we are looking through what those spatial data sets are that are needed immediately when disaster hits, and then understanding the availability of that data. Where is their data? Aligning with where are we anticipating those disasters across the world to be, and then also understand a little bit better options to fill those gaps. A lot of times we don't really have that time to thoughtfully think through the different options to fill those data sets. And then as part of that, we're also looking at the access of that spatial data. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with HDX's platform. They have a lot of open data, and that's where a lot of consumers and people using open spatial data are accessing that. So part of this project is looking at localization of place names in multiple languages and making sure that data is a little is better parsed out to make sure that like road names, place names, it's just easier to use. So that's kind of the front end of the project, and then through that, we decided to focus a little bit, do a deeper dive on populated places, like populated place names and locations and roads. Those are two data sets that we have, after talking to partners, have identified as two types of data sets that are really useful in a crisis, because you need to know right where the population centers are and then how to get to them. And other data sets we've already focused on. So through this project, we're going to be looking at 4 countries to kind of look to see what the availability is for that and build relationships with partners throughout the network and data users to look to see how we can preemptively fill those gaps in 4 countries. So that is my thing.
That was very succinct, and the point about making accessibility at the local level is a really important one, and I think one we'll hear more about and come back to as well. First, though, we'll hear from Emily Elderfield, who's from Clear Global, who's advocacy officer, and you're going to talk a little bit about translation of some of this information into languages that local populations are using.
Fab. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So we all know in the room that disadvantaged and marginalized population groups are disproportionately at higher risk in any hazardous events, and effective anticipatory action requires their input to best identify and monitor and plan for these risks. But data on the languages that these groups use is typically missing from global hazard data. Governments and the international organizations that support them also lack data on data to understand language-based exclusion in anticipatory action to prepare and reduce the impact of hazardous events. So as a result, any pre-existing exclusion that's happening of anyone who faces a language or a wider communication barrier is reproduced and potentially aggravated by exclusionary community consultation and planning processes and the resulting targeting of scarce resources towards groups that actually might not be the groups facing the greatest risk. Language-based exclusion is a compounding factor of disadvantage for individuals who, for example, lack access to education and opportunities for social participation. It disproportionately results in reduced access to services and information for women and girls, for people with disabilities, older people, and members of minority faiths and ethnicities. We already know at Clear Global that communities at high risk of natural disasters are also likely to be extremely linguistically diverse and underserved by the humanitarian sector's current approach to language. So just as a couple of illustrative points, approximately 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in so-called hotspots of high climate climate vulnerability across the African region, South Asia, South and Central America, and small island developing states. All of these are highly multilingual contexts. And then the 3 countries facing the highest risk from natural disasters all speak hundreds of languages between them. The Philippines uses over 120, India 123 major languages and several hundred minor ones, and Indonesia over 800. Language exclusion carries major risk for the effectiveness of anticipatory action in any setting. In fragile and conflict-affected contexts in which about 79% of anticipatory action funding is currently concentrated, it has the potential to be devastating. It can exacerbate intercommunity tension. It can undermine efforts at conflict resolution by entrenching identity-based inequalities. To define community priorities and needs, identify local response capacities, and ensure that risk tracking translates into effective communication of early warning messages. Governments and their anticipatory action supporters needs to know which languages the different sections of their populations can actually speak and understand. Right now, there is no ready reference for that information for most countries at risk from natural hazards and conflict. There is no instant, accessible, usable data plugged into relevant data systems specifically for anticipatory action. And that's the gap that we're trying to fill. For some time now at Clear Global, we have been compiling and publishing language maps and open source data sets on language use in several at-risk countries. These are regularly among the most downloaded on the H2X platform. And this new project is going to really elevate our work in this area to provide more comprehensive, more accurate, and more accessible knowledge on language use. The system that we're building under this project is designed to meet the needs of the emerging anticipatory action processes and models by providing standardized data and products in a sustainable system that can scale both in terms of data and in functionality. We're specifically aiming to process up to 100 language data sets from large-scale sources like national censuses, the mix and the DHS surveys, multi-sector needs assessments, which will cover at least 50 countries, in addition to the maps and data we already have online. And we'll do this while building a system that will provide ongoing opportunities to integrate this data and knowledge and its related vulnerability throughout the humanitarian system. Having this data means that response organizations are much better placed to assess the language profiles of at-risk communities and proactively channel resources to plug communication gaps as early as possible. In practice, this will look different each time, but it could look like identifying the 2 or 3 most dominant languages, community languages, and pre-translating and piloting template early warning information or wider risk communication material ahead of the next disaster hitting. It can include identifying hotspots of high multilingualism, linguistic diversity, or communities with particularly low education where investment in something non-text-based can bring a much higher return. Crucially, it will give responders an evidence base to understand where heightened vulnerability to a disaster is made even worse through language exclusion, such as where female-headed households, for example, have no household member who can speak a national or dominant language. That was a very quick overview, and I'm really excited about the discussion. And I'm joined online today as well by my colleague Jason Simons, who is leading the data piece of this project, so he can field any technical questions on the platform itself. Thank you.
Thanks, and we'll come back to this, but I might just ask a quick follow-up question, which is we know generally that people being able to access information in languages that they speak is really important to their experience of humanitarian assistance generally, but that it remains very under-prioritized in the system. That being the case, as we scale up, or as the system scales up anticipatory mechanisms, how can we avoid some of those pitfalls and that neglect being repeated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that what we're seeking to avoid is people relying only on assumptions. So I think what we see in a lot of contexts is people, for example, assuming that Swahili and Lingala are sufficient for risk communication in DRC. Let's take that as an example. Or actors looking at providing cyclone warning information to the Rohingya community in Bangladesh, thinking that Chittagonian is similar enough to Rohingya that it's sufficient. So we're looking at basically providing an evidence base for people to test those assumptions, hopefully before a crisis escalates or before a disaster hits, so that they're better placed to channel resources to somewhere where they can hopefully have a disproportionately positive impact. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Moving on to Christina Weil from Insecurity Insight, Director of Insecurity Insight, and also a member of the H2H board. One of the things that we have seen is that, you know, for reasons that we understand, anticipatory action has developed more in response to natural hazards and in those kind of contexts, but pushing into protracted crisis and conflict settings is going to be crucial. And yeah, with that in mind, it'd be great to hear a bit more about your project.
Thank you. Yeah, so at Insecurity Insight, we monitor incidents that affect the delivery of aid with a particular focus on the aid operation itself, but also healthcare, education, and food security. And for this particular anticipatory action project, we are taking this approach of looking at conflict incidents in Mali with a view to thinking about structures within an AA framework of how to deal with programming in such settings. And traditionally, the anticipatory action approach has had an angle of conflict sensitivity and has sort of tried to predict conflict. But what we are trying to do with this project is not to predict conflict, but to look at the consequences of individual events and to predict what this means for people's livelihoods and well-being, and therefore what kind of humanitarian action is needed to remedy these impacts. So to be specific, in Mali, we've identified that burning of granaries where people stock their millet in particular are typically attacked during conflict events. So we are trying to understand how exactly this impacts on people's access to food when these events happen. And usually it's their food stocks that are stored for a long period of time. So the impact is not immediate. It is when people need to draw on their food stocks that the impact of these events really hits them. So the objective is to see what can be done to intervene at that moment with potentially food aid to avoid other follow-on consequences like displacement that may happen at the point when people run out of food stocks. So that's a sort of concrete example of how we are thinking about looking at conflict events in order to identify where humanitarian intervention can happen. So I leave it there for the moment, but also very excited to sort of think of how we can bring all of this into the wider humanitarian sector.
Thanks. Thanks, Christina. That was really helpful. Now moving online, Elisa Schmidt from Ground Truth Solutions, where she's a program director, is going to talk about their project. I hope you can hear us and we can hear you. Please feel free to jump in.
Thank you so much. I hope, yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Everything?
Great. Yeah,
Okay.
loud and clear.
Thank you so much. Yes, I work for Ground Truth Solutions. For those of you who do not know us, we are an international NGO, and our work really focuses on ensuring that people affected by crisis have a say in humanitarian assistance. We've been doing this for over a decade now, gathering data on community perceptions, priorities, and preferences, and working with humanitarian organizations to feed that data into decision making. And in a lot of the contexts we work in, anticipatory action has become a key strategy. And so we really want to think about now, how can we use our methodology and gather evidence that can support the design and implementation of anticipatory action programs. Our project will take place in Chad. It is a context we've been working in for many years now. It is somewhere where anticipatory action is a key strategy. It is also somewhere where people affected by crisis have told us time and time again that they do not feel sufficiently involved in the process, where they feel like aid is sometimes inadequate because their views are not taken into account. So we thought this was a really a good opportunity to pilot the adoption of our methodology for anticipatory action to make sure that community perceptions are integrated from the beginning to avoid this type of feedback in the future. So we plan on doing this through conducting a series of focus group discussions and key informant interviews with communities, with local organizations, with also the big organizations implementing anticipatory action in Chad to understand what their expectations and priorities are for anticipatory action and the types of involvement they would like to have in an anticipatory action program. And through that process, craft a survey tool that we can use to systematically collect perception data and feed that data into the design of Anticipatory Action Program, with the goal of ensuring that it has a meaningful impact on community members. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for now and can provide more information later on. Thank you so much.
Thanks. That's really clear. I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up as well, which is I know you've already been working in Chad for some time. How do the agencies there that are both doing, traditional humanitarian program, but also building these AA mechanisms, how are they perceiving the work that you're planning to do? What's their perspective on it?
We've spoken to a few partners now who think it would be very useful to have this independent data that can supplement existing tools. I mean, of course, we are not, we're not saying we want to replace anything that's currently ongoing on community engagement or any other tools to capture community needs, but provide this additional tool. So I think there's been, people see it as quite a useful mechanism to have this regular overview of community perceptions.
Thanks. That's very helpful. So we've heard from 4 of the 5 projects. The 5th project is Carto-NG, and I see 2 colleagues from Carto-NG sitting in the front. So I'll give you an opportunity later on if you want to jump in. But before we do that, I hope people appreciate that this is a really wide range of approaches and focus areas, which will be contributing and work in different ways and in different locations. And I want to sort of set that within the broader context. And to do that, I'm going to call on the help of Marcus Enenkel from the World Bank, where he's a risk financing expert who's also been helping us with this program of work and has shared his perspectives with us before. Marcus, I wonder if you could help us set the scene a bit. What do you think's important and exciting here, and what are the different directions that we could begin to take this in, and some of the considerations we'd need to have when doing that?
Hello from Washington. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm really happy to see how these 4, very likely 5 projects later on complement each other. So that's fantastic. It really speaks to different issues that we've been talking about for a long time with a partly very narrow application that fills a concrete gap. So that's awesome. That's really great. What we are seeing is that there's a lot of movement to complement this locally led perspective in a way that local people actually have a voice. And having a voice actually means moving away from only looking at a quantitative perspective to a qualitative perspective. We're talking about risk perception. We're talking about different languages that play a role that haven't been considered in the past. I also think that there is I see a strong movement to tackle this one issue, that's this one elephant in the room that has been in the room for a very long time, and that is evidence generation. Right? If you talk to, we did that in 2021 when OCHA presented anticipatory action in front of the G7 as the new thing, as the new preferred humanitarian approach, as they call it. Pretty much everyone was saying that what's standing in the way of faster scaling of anticipatory action was the lack of evidence. So what you're saying partly also fills this gap, but this will also require gathering and understanding the evidence of the added value of anticipatory action in a more holistic sense, right? The promise is pretty clear. Anticipatory action is supposed to be faster and it's supposed to be cheaper, but it's also supposed to be more dignified. So this, to me personally, is the most important part. At the end of the day, it needs to be a more dignified aspect of humanitarian systems, of humanitarian program. The question is, what exactly does more dignified mean, and how do you measure it? I was surprised about myself that the issue that Clear Global are tackling, this language this linguistic diversity, as you call it, that wasn't on my radar. I really think this is a very cool idea. The others are as well, but the others were more on my radar than this one. I believe this also strengthens the evidence generation. It really helps to complement the bigger picture from so many perspectives: indigenous knowledge, risk perception, everything that goes in this direction. Two quick thoughts on what I believe is important when we talk about new directions, what approaches, what instruments can or should be explored further. There is a lot of duplication going on, not only in the humanitarian sector. Everyone is coming at anticipatory action through a specific mandate, through a specific mindset. You might be an economist, you might have been in humanitarian programming all your life. You might become through a GIS mindset. But ultimately, and now wearing my World Bank hat, even between the World Bank's development finance, the World Bank's disaster risk, forward-looking disaster risk finance, even parametric insurance activities, there is a lot of overlap with anticipatory action. We don't need to assess the same risk over and over again. I mean, actually, we do need to update the risk assessments, but we don't need to do the same risk assessment for the same hazard in the same region through a humanitarian lens and a disaster risk finance lens. The fact that there are still conversations going on if disaster risk finance is a part of anticipatory action or vice versa, the other way around, that's a completely different discussion. But I believe that if we put our heads together more frequently, and that means establishing an environment where we really trust each other, and with we, I mean people from different organizations with different mindsets that potentially have a very different focus when it comes to programming, not only humanitarian programming, we can do a better job at saving resources and avoiding the duplication of efforts. And risk assessments are just one example for a more efficient collaborative model. And the last thing that I'd like to mention in the context of what could come next is also an overarching topic. Whenever you are developing, designing, calibrating, validating a new project or tweaking an existing model, you need to literally ground truth it, right? And so we recently looked into the disaster statistics, just at the highest level, national scale disaster statistics globally. And it turns out that also in the context of the largest policies, early warnings for all, strongly WMO, UNDRR driven, we don't talk about gaps. And that is really, really problematic. We're assuming that what disaster statistics are depicting as the number of people affected, these hazard-specific, event-specific casualties, we take that all as granted. And so when we looked at the data gaps in one of the largest, or I believe the most widely used emergency database, which is MDAT, it turns out that there's not only huge gaps, but specific gaps in specific hazard categories. And that's a big problem, right? Because if you look at climatological events and you're seeing that only 1 in 3 events has any casualty data associated with it, much higher than for hydrological or meteorological events, meaning floods, primarily floods and storms, that is at least something that should be on our radar. It is something that can be improved. We have technologies available. We have satellite data available. I'm not saying we can close all gaps simultaneously, but we're living in a time where in most narratives, in most strategies that use such large databases to strengthen the argument that more efficient, more forward-looking humanitarian programming is needed. Gaps are not tackled at all. And when I say gaps, we don't even know if a 0 is a 0 or if a 0 means no data at all. And that's particularly a problem for slow onset disasters, primarily for drought. So just a few points here, just some food for discussion. Happy to continue later.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll definitely come back and pick up on some of those points. I think the one about duplication is a really interesting one, you know, and I think what I find interesting is it's really important as new ideas and as new techniques are being developed, that there are different people working on things, that there is a plurality of approaches and action, but then because we're not in a sort of market-based system, we don't really have the mechanisms to choose which ones are working best and to refine and convene around a certain set, and how we do that, I think is a really important part of the conversation, and how we convene around that. I might open up and see if there are questions in the room before we go to the discussion questions that we have, if that's okay. So I know the room's not set up, but it would be great if we could have a bit of a conversation around this. So if there are any questions either in the room or online, either to specific panelists or more broadly, please raise your hand now, or for those online, I think pop a question in the chat and we can collect those as well. Please, there's a microphone, and if you could introduce yourself, who you are and where you're from, that would be really helpful as well.
Thank you so much. I'm Wad. I work for the OCHA pooled funds in Syria. I have a general question actually on the data collection. In some context where data sharing is restricted, even from either from authorities or sometimes beneficiaries or targeted population might fear to share data with foreign entities, even with local entities. So this is my first question. And the other one is about the data sharing policy. So the final products will be available in public, or what is usually the data sharing policy? If you could maybe elaborate on this. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Are there any other questions, or should we jump in? Who would like to?
I can start from our side.
Please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. HOT, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, in the last couple of years has been rolling out a data protection framework for exactly what you're saying. For us, a lot of what we're focusing on is reference infrastructure, so like roads, buildings, land use. So it's not like personally identifiable information. I think I'll let other colleagues speak to that, because that definitely comes with its own sense of data security and protection, make sure who has access to that is very controlled. But the data that should and can be more open, like a road, it's more about the method that you're approaching collecting that and where you're sharing it. We found that, for example, in Syria, actually, after the Turkey-Syria earthquake, that the impacted area was across different areas of influence. And so the way that we approached it was through the humanitarian principles and just looking at the whole area and looking at the data gaps as opposed to where individual actors were, because the perception of bias and real bias is real, right? So I think that just knowing the context you're working in, and making sure that you are approaching it in a way that is based on need, and then making sure that you're also communicating your decision making and your results with everybody. You know, you're not just talking to one group, to then open that feedback loop, because we can't think of everything, right? So we need to make sure that we're talking to humanitarians, local governments, you know, all that. And I think the last part of your question was about the results. From our side, everything will be open. That's kind of one of our biggest values at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. But that's because, yeah, our project is designed over things that can be public. Yeah, the roads and the place names. But there are other projects that I would say, yeah, you just have to look at that tiered access. But it's a really good question. I'm glad you brought it up, because we do work in very sensitive contexts, and yeah, it's not an easy answer. Do you have?
So go for it, Christine.
Yeah, not all that much to add because I think it was already really well articulated what the key things are. It's really important never to share personal identifiable information. And the moment it is communicating general results, to do it in such a way that they're general and you just cannot work out where exactly they came from, but they're still actionable for the humanitarian sector. And then the other point I think I would also very much agree with. In my view, it is very important to put the data out there because that is an invitation to everyone to respond. Because data is always biased, no matter how hard we try. And by putting it out, we're giving everyone the opportunity to tell us the added story that we have missed. And that's why I personally think openness in data is what is needed rather than restricting it. Because I think we're opening it up to people by sharing rather than to putting them at risk, as long as we don't put anything personal identifiable in there. And the final point I would make is, I think it's also important that it is not organizations who work in the country who put it out there, because they may put their operations at risk. But this is where I see the added value of H2H organizations who are quite often remote, and we can do it. We can take that risk and we can carry that for the humanitarian community, contributing access to information in that way.
Yeah, a quick one to kind of wrap up that point is I think language is a really interesting thing to look at with your questions because it can be incredibly dangerous to publish information on language. If we look at contexts where there's interethnic conflict or extreme discrimination of certain indigenous groups, for example, language would be a key consideration in terms of people's safety. So we will be making everything open source, and that's the idea, is that we're making this as usable as possible for people who don't have a data background or don't have a language background to be able to see really quickly, you know, how can I actually communicate best with the people I'm trying to and bring the relevant actors into decision making. We have internal processes. Jason, I'm not sure if you want to come in very quickly. We have internal risk assessment processes when we're working with a new language to make sure that we've identified if there are any potential dangers happening and how we can mitigate those. I'm not sure if you want one sentence on that, Jason, because that's not what I work on.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, the idea really with this system is to be quite controlled about the data and about how we're using it and how we're managing it. And one of those things is about taking very clear assessment of risk as part of the publication process. So we will make the data open, but we will do so whilst assessing risk, and and part of that is reliability. We don't want to be publishing data that we don't we don't think is correct, but at the same time there's a balance, like Christina was saying and others have been saying. We want to publish that data and make it open so that we can move on to the steps of ground truthing it. So we have a bit of a balance here between knowing that data is reliable, or being considering that maybe it's not quite right, but the way to improve it is actually to get it out there and see how we can improve that with input from the community. And so yeah, there's definitely a balance there, but it's all done in a very sort of controlled and thoughtful way.
Thanks. That's a really helpful addition. Are there, does Alida or Marcus, do you have any points on this, or should we move on?
I just wanted to jump in quickly, since ground truth, we collect
Please.
a lot of quite sensitive information, especially considering community perceptions and their relationships with various actors. But just to stress that all of our surveys are, of course, anonymous, with very strict data protection protocols in place to make sure that we can accurately share what people think without putting them at risk. We also test all of our questions before we do the surveys to make sure that they are safe. We've had situations in the past where we've removed questions from surveys because the risk was deemed too high. And so, we really make sure that this is, that people can share their views in the most safe way possible. And yeah, this is really at the core of what we do, and we believe in that very strongly.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I'm going to move on to another question to the panel, which is around, we've heard that there are opportunities around anticipatory action, but also challenges, and striking the balance between that sort of optimism and realism. So yeah, how do we make the most of it, realize the potential, but also accept that it's not going to be a panacea that's applicable in all contexts? Marcus, I wonder if I could go to you first on that.
Thanks. There are many discussions about where or in which context anticipatory action is the right tool, but very few about where it's not. So I believe, obviously, humanitarian assistance, any type of humanitarian assistance, must not only be locally led, or should not only be locally led, but demand driven. I'm personally not primarily interested in just broadening access and to anticipatory action, or the implementation of anticipatory action, but to actually support the process of coupling increased resilience and shock protection of the most vulnerable communities, to ultimately reduce the need for large scale and very expensive and often very inefficient emergency response. So if this means scaling up anticipatory action, that's absolutely fantastic. But there are scenarios in which anticipatory action will not be the right tool, and we need to have an honest conversation about that. So if the alternative is a well-coordinated early response, that's great as well. If it's demand-driven, if it's all about protecting lives and livelihoods, then this is the most important thing. You've already talked about conflict earlier, and I was silently nodding in the background, because I believe that we need to clearly distinguish the type of crisis that we're talking about, the type of crisis that we're tackling. Obviously, political conflict is a completely different challenge than a drought or a flood, particularly because the onset of conflict cannot reliably be predicted. So if you work with the consequences or the early consequences of conflict, that's definitely a smart way of dealing with things. There are other workarounds as well, right? If you, for instance, tackle regions with periodic events during elections, there have been interesting conversations recently about that, but I'm not aware of any operational anticipatory action projects. As I said earlier, I think better coordination and communication across actors, but also across scales, is an important thing. Obviously, none of the instruments, none of the approaches that we have available is a panacea. But particularly in regions where we have different mechanisms in place for the same hazard, that could be anticipatory action along with a micro level financial instrument, and in addition to a sovereign level financial instrument. And communities might also have, in many cases, their own locally led resilience building mechanisms in place, such as village savings and loans. So the only way to tackle this is to really be aware of the need to coordinate across actors and across scales. Recently, we had discussions about the interoperability of anticipatory action with a larger risk financing scheme. And there are interesting concepts where it's not only a staged trigger within the anticipation system, within the AA system. You don't only have a watch trigger and then an action trigger, but there is a way, currently in concept phase, but hopefully soon a pilot, where it's possible to use anticipatory action itself as a trigger. So once an early action protocol has been triggered, a larger risk financing scheme could be coupled with it. This would tackle different issues at the same time. You could use the same risk assessment. You could scale things up potentially a lot faster. And you would be able to very likely, at least in a few scenarios that I can think of, to more efficiently close the gap between humanitarian assistance and an additional shock protection layer. I hope there'll be something that we can share soon. But I think this is one of the most exciting approaches to embed anticipatory action into this larger disaster risk management universe. There are a few questions in the chat as well. I'm not sure if you saw them. Thanks.
We're going to come to those in a minute. Before we do that, Jesse, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think that, and I think, Marcus, you touched on this a little bit, that collaboration across H2H and all humanitarian actors is really, I think there's a huge potential here to focus anticipatory action. Each of our organizations come with a unique perspective. And when you're looking at anticipatory action, what's really challenging is it covers such a big scope of different types of events, but also geographically. And so if it was just me working at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, narrowing down what I thought was the most useful, like I might just be looking at spatial data availability and maybe pull in like a risk assessment, right? But there's other things that go into that besides just data availability and reliability, but also the different contexts and how to actually pull those expertise together to see not just what event might happen, but what event also needs preparation for, like what, because hypothetically there are events that will happen that we're as prepared for as we think we can be, but there's a lot that aren't. And I really think that that is where humanitarian networks need to work together on to identify those problems that we can anticipate. We just need to talk about it. So I'm really excited about this program and hopefully diving into that to set precedent for future actions and actually forecasting together.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a good call to action. Eliza online, what's your perspective on this? Conscious that the where you're working, is one of the most complex of emergencies. Interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much. And I completely agree with what has been said by Marcus and by Jesse, 100%. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's really important to keep talking to people that all of these initiatives are meant to benefit and to understand like what priorities they have and what type of challenges they face. I think, asking people what the benefits of anticipatory action is great, and we should be sharing that in forums like these, talking about the successes and the failures of anticipatory action. But in our experience, when we want to talk to people about these specific, interventions, they also want to talk about other things. And one of the examples I want to bring here is we recently did a study in Nigeria trying to understand how people were impacted by anticipatory cash assistance. And of course, like people, when you ask them, was this helpful? They say yes, it was really great at helping reduce losses and damages from floods. And they're really supportive of this these more proactive responses to crises that they face every year. But at the same time, they also said, this is great, but this is still a relatively short-term benefit for us. What we really need is we need to change livelihoods. We need to, shift from wet to dry season farming, and we need to do this now. And actually what you need to help us with is to do this transition so that when you provide anticipatory cash assistance, we do not have to use that money to switch our livelihoods, and we can use that for other things, like to actually prepare for the flood that's coming. And so I think really by asking people what are their priorities and what are their challenges and how can we support that, and then anticipatory action becomes part of this bigger, this bigger puzzle with other interventions that come and support that. So I really believe strongly in of course, asking people directly what they think.
Thanks. One of the things that GTS's work always reminds me of is that, and it'll be true in anticipatory action, is that if you're going to ask people what they want, you have to be prepared that they're not going to tell you the things that you want to hear. And how does the humanitarian system respond to that? Emily, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, thanks. I think, You actually summed it up in one sentence, Jesse, when you said we just need to talk about it. I think when we're looking at this in terms of language inclusion, I think that the better that we get as a sector at understanding where language exclusion is happening and being proactive about reducing it, and sort of making sure that key actors are better brought into the conversation, the more information we all have to be adapting anticipatory action to each context, and to not risk it just becoming a panacea, as you were saying in your question, Kim, and to have those conversations where perhaps at the end of the day we're saying, okay, at this particular moment in this particular context, this isn't the right strategy. It's not aligned with community priorities. But we can't take that yes/no decision if we're ultimately just talking to ourselves, right? I think if anticipatory action is applied without paying attention to or listening to the voices of the communities that it's trying to support, then it just perpetuates the risk of becoming this abstract, system-driven, pretty top-down approach that doesn't achieve nearly half the impact that it potentially could. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot. I'll come back for see if there's any more questions in the room, but first I know there are some questions online, but I can't see them. So Hannah, would you be so kind to jump in with them?
So we have a question from Charlotta. She asks, what are your views on tackling the lack of evidence, so back to what you were saying, of impact challenge in anticipatory action?
Okay.
Who wants to come in on that? And I would add, whose evidence?
The lack of evidence of impact challenge.
Yeah.
Marcus, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can say a few words about that. So obviously it's always easier said than done, right? But what we've seen is that obviously if you manage to get the evaluation component directly into your project design and you actually get that funded, that's a very big strength of the project itself. Obviously, the funding for the evaluation cannot exceed the cost of the entire project. It's also something that I've seen. In general, the ideal scenario would be to have an actual randomized control trial, right? To have your control groups, you have your statistics, you do tons of data collection, then tons of data crunching, then you have your results. But if you're realistic, that's not always possible. In fact, in many cases, it's not possible because it's just not feasible from I would even say feasible from a financial perspective, at least not now. The solution then, I mean, there are not too many alternatives. One would be to not go through the entire process of setting up an experimental setup and become too sciencey, or just sciencey enough, not sure. But there are natural experiments that you can do with a project that has already been implemented. And in addition, something that Carlotta will definitely be fond of is the entire satellite component. But just like with anticipatory action, all kinds of and mobile technologies, of course. So just like with all kinds of new technologies, we need to have an open dialogue and open discussion about the scenarios in which these new technologies are actually feasible. Again, coming back to Zoom just recommended switching to Chinese, so I hope I still sound English. So that we have an actual dialogue about in which scenario there is the technology can actually have an added value to generate evidence that's not just interesting, but actually that provides us insights to learn from the mistakes of previous project implementation.
Yeah, super interesting. And obviously we need to do more on evidence, but I would also say, you know, the counterpoint is a lot of standard humanitarian programming where the evidence base is either very weak or where we have evidence of what's going wrong and don't do anything to change. So what are we comparing to? I don't know if others want to come in on that question.
Kind of briefly, I think, Marcus, just to build on what you were saying is the argument for a mixed methodological approach, that if you just do needs surveys or you just look at Earth observation satellite data, like those are kind of two very ends of the spectrum. Like you're not going to get the whole picture. And if those don't agree, I think that's okay, right? Like I think it's just two different perspectives, and that's just how things in life are. And being able to see multiple sides, I think, is kind of how to approach that.
Sorry for those online, we're just getting another question in the room. Mike's moving around.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. I'm called Malika Noisette and I work with the IFRC Geneva office. I wanted to hear your views a bit on impact-based forecasting, because that's one of the things that we work on. And of course, getting all the data on vulnerabilities, capacities, and exposure is key. Getting it up to date is another challenge. But then for anticipatory action, what's super important is to compile this data with the weather forecast data and be able to come with the risk, and to be able to have a system as well which monitors this, which will give us a specific trigger and will monitor the risk and will help us to activate anticipatory action when it's really needed. So having access to those data and updated it is already challenging, but it's just, yeah, a few pieces of the puzzle. But to complete it, we need to have as well platforms which can indeed make all those calculations together with weather forecast, if it's a weather-related event or other type of forecast for non-weather-related events, to be able to analyze this information on an almost daily basis or seasonal basis for us to know exactly when it's time to act. And that's also linked to what was mentioned by Marcus about having avoiding to duplicate risk assessment and having, yeah, all the same picture and all the same understanding on the humanitarian needs and when it's time to act. We are also having discussions within the movement on what's the best level to have this kind of platform. So is it at national level to make sure that it's fully hosted, to make sure that there's also coordination among humanitarian actors at national level, or is it at global level? And yeah, there are pros and cons. We try a little bit, both options, but we have not come up with a really nice and very robust approach, I would say. So I wanted to, hear from the panel if you have any experience to share on this. Thank you.
No, thank you for this really excellent question. And I'm afraid I don't think I've got anything very concrete to suggest on a platform, except that I agree it is a question of having access to all this information. What I would add to that, what I think on this ideal platform, what is also needed and what I'm really think currently is in many contexts missing, is that data that would give you an idea of when conflict is also impacting on the whole sort of situation, because all these sort of data models for forecasting have all been driven very much by natural disasters, by floods, etc. And that I think has also sort of led to perhaps a blind eye on how conflict also both can be a driver on particular needs, but also quite often when there are natural disasters, the conflict dynamics also fast change. And I think that's the sort of the piece of the puzzle that we are missing in this big data pool at the moment in terms of doing all this analysis and doing the prediction. And that's sort of what we're trying to do here a little bit, of trying to think, what would that data be? And I think some of this event data that comes from observed conflict events can do that, as long as we understand what the consequences of these events are for humanitarian needs, not in order to try to prevent the violence as such, because that's not the objective as a humanitarian organization. But that's all to say that I think I agree. We need to think of where is this place where all this information can be accessed, and then if we're thinking about where would this conflict information sit, it gets even more complicated because that can be highly sensitive to have that at a national level or somewhere else. So it's a super important question, and I don't think one where there is a really an easy answer. My personal take would be very much along the lines of what we've said here. Let's make it open access and let people take it, and they can use it then. And it doesn't have to be part of a formalized system, because then you avoid this discussion of what is the true or the correct or the appropriate conflict data. But that's just a thought. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Just a quick reflection as well. I don't have an answer to what was an excellent question either, but to kind of broaden the discussion that you were talking about, Christina, on kind of open access data. We don't, as an organization, go out and collect raw data on language. The information that we use already exists in various surveys and various kind of large scale data sets, but it's just not usable in a moment where you have a lot of time pressure and a lot of resource pressure to make quite quick decisions. And so I think it's also interesting to think about, okay, what piece of this is actually about the data itself, and what piece of this is actually about better collaboration and better agreeing, and perhaps all collectively agreeing to be a bit less protective about our own sort of specialisms, I guess, and saying, okay, we don't need to be known as the language specialist actor. We're doing this for each other organizationally, and kind of where are there opportunities to better be collaborating and to better be working on a more systemic level. I think actually a lot of the issues are not about lack of data itself. So just reflection point on that.
Thanks. Does anyone from our online panel want to jump in and tackle this one as well? Marcus, yeah, sorry, I can't see the screen very well. So
Yeah, sorry. I don't know where I am in the room.
No, go ahead.
Just one thought on this multiple purposes, of collecting the data. I believe impact-based forecasting is the natural consequence. I've seen exciting work supported by Red Cross 510 for tropical storms. I'm aware that frequently updating a vulnerability layer means a lot of work, but highlighting that the vulnerability layer for one project solves or fills different gaps at the same time would be important, right? I'm pretty sure everyone's aware of that, but just to throw this out there, obviously, if the hazard in focus is a tropical storm, all insights related to the vulnerability profiles or coping capacities of vulnerable communities in the target area, they can be useful for pretty much every other hazard, right? So it's a cross-fertilization of this effort to update the vulnerability profile. Just to throw this out there.
Thanks a lot. Do we have another question online? Please go ahead, Hannah. Thanks.
So we have Maura asking, first of all, she says, all of these projects are impressive and very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Outside of funding mechanisms, how is anticipatory action any different from professional humanitarian response? By separating these kinds of projects, risk assessment, evidence, data insights from local populations, communication, language assessment, does the sector make them piecemeal and no nice to haves rather than part of core costs and embedded in humanitarian action for a professional humanitarian response?
Who wants to jump in on that? You.
I think that's a great question, and I think one that we've all had at some point. But I think the more I look into it and the possibilities, that it's almost doing the opposite of piecemealing it. I think it's bringing things together. Thinking about HOT and how we work across the disaster cycle, our disaster response looks very different than disaster risk reduction work and preparedness. Preparedness tends to be much more on the ground with local communities, very context specific, where disaster response is that very quick, you jump in, you use the structures you know, because you don't have time to do anything else. And I see anticipatory action as kind of a bridge between those. They can inform each other. And I think there's potential there.
Yeah, I think very much agreeing with that. I think that was a great question, first of all. That was a really interesting question. But I think what we're seeing from the language side is what this platform is going to allow us and then the organizations who use the data to do is precisely not be piecemeal about it. It's about recognizing that there is a huge lack of awareness on language inclusion and language exclusion as a sector in and outside of anticipatory action. It's present in the development sector, it's present in humanitarian, it's present in disaster risk, it's present everywhere. And I think that, you know, the platform is not only going to be open to people who are running anticipatory action projects, right? It's about understanding how do we go about the work that we do, regardless of the nature of the work, in a way that is much more inclusive and much more horizontal and gives us much more information and better information to be making better decisions. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, echoing everyone here, this is an absolutely excellent question. So I just want to add one thing why I think I see it quite similar to what has already been echoed. But what I wanted to add is that I think what we as these sort of small, nimble H2H organizations are doing is that we also breaking down some silos that exist within the very structured humanitarian response. And I can say in the sort of very specific case of where we as Insecurity Insight are coming from, we're coming originally from the security risk management for aid agencies. And I'm sure you've all had experiences with some security risk managers who you may sort of think as the guy at the end of the corridor who you go to who then tells you you can't go somewhere. But what we are trying to do here is taking the learning that comes from security risk management that has evolved enormously and that has ways of forecasting, of thinking about SOPs and many other things, and saying, well, how can we actually apply them to something that's more programmatic, that can actually help us to sort of think about some of these broader, difficult questions about the humanitarian access and protecting the people who the work is for. So that to say is, I think by coming at it a little bit from the outside, we're challenging some of the existing working structures and we're cross-fertilizing from different areas. And therefore, I hope we're really bringing something to the humanitarian response rather than duplicating or sort of being on the outside.
Interesting. Yeah. Does anyone online want to jump in? Please just go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to say that, yeah, absolutely great question. And I think, yeah, what we do at Ground Truth as well is that we don't just collect data for the sake of collecting data. We really want to make sure that that data is used and that, you know, people's views are actually considered. So we really, you know, work within the humanitarian coordination and within the humanitarian response to see how, you know, we can better act on these findings. And so, yeah, really trying to avoid that this becomes like a piecemeal exercise, like was mentioned in the question, and to make sure that it's actually really embedded within what organizations are actually doing.
The question that I had to myself was, I understand that anticipatory action around the globe with hundreds of early action protocols in place can be perceived as very scattered. What can we do to change that as a risk financing anticipatory action community? I have no immediate answer to
that. Thanks a lot. Any other questions in the room or online? I have a couple of final questions that I want to ask. One is just around the broader implications for policy and funding. I also wanted to ask one about the pushing this into conflict as well, which is what are the hard constraints there about our ability to understand and predict conflict dynamics versus technological advancements allowing us to get better at that and build that in. What's the balance between those as well? Sorry, that's not on the list, so I hope it's okay. But if anyone wants to, Christina, I'm looking at you, but others might have views too. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, yesterday in a panel, someone said, prediction is always difficult, and in particular, the future. And I think that's very true. And I think we should not make the mistake to think we can predict conflict, because this is not about a divination class that Harry Potter would go to in Hogwarts, that you sort of know what's going to happen. So what we need to do is understand the typical scenarios that happen and understand what the consequences of individual types of events are for the population, and in particular for the type of humanitarian action that's required as a response. And as anticipatory action always asks, what sort of data can we have for our triggers that we know we need to act? I think we need to think of particular incidents that happen and affect the communities to then know, well, what will happen next that makes all of this even worse? And that would then be the sort of the trigger information to know to come in and try to mitigate, to make sure the consequences are not as bad as they can be, because you avoid the second, the third, the fourth tier of consequences of conflict on communities. So that's the sort of the broad thinking that comes from that. But yeah, I think let's try not to do divination, but be focused on the humanitarian need that follows from an event.
Thanks.
I'll come in on the first question on kind of policy implications, just on a quick point, because I think that there's really interesting potential. There was a report that I was reading recently that was from UNFPA and Queen Mary University of London that looked at about 120-ish countries' nationally determined contributions under the UNFCCC. And it looked at kind of how many of them were talking about linkages to other critical issues and critical vulnerabilities. And it found things like about just under 40 of the NDCs directly acknowledged in some way the link between the climate crisis and sexual and reproductive health and rights. 100 countries acknowledged the role and the impact of youth within climate action. And I feel like acknowledging language and language vulnerability is a next logical step, in the same way that we're starting to see better linkages in policy in terms of disability inclusion or various kind of intersections between health and disaster or health and conflict. So I think that's going to be really exciting, but we need to be starting from a data-driven point and not just starting from assumptions about who can understand us and who can't. So that's hopefully what we're going to be helping organizations to be doing. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Anyone else would like to jump in? Marcus, I have you down, but others, if you have final thoughts you want to share, please go ahead.
I just need to manage to unmute myself. I just thought of an ODI report that I read recently, which featured a quote of Sadako Ogata, who was the first woman to lead UNHCR, and she said that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. And she was referring to a problematic narrative in which particularly climate change is depicted as a humanitarian crisis for which the main response should be to expand the role of humanitarians and their resources. Obviously, it's this, at least in most sectors that I interacted with, the dominating narrative was different, in a way that many of us are really trying to tackle causes instead of symptoms. And obviously the solution is better integration of humanitarian programming, of forward-looking approaches, of resilience building mechanisms into a larger, not into the impact management, but the actual risk management, ideally through a nexus approach. Obviously, this is such a nice buzzword. We evaluated different climate change, disaster risk reduction policies of some of the largest aid organizations. And when you talk to the senior leadership of these organizations, sometimes they were laughing at the notion of a nexus approach, because they were saying, this is not what mandates look like. This is not the reality. Of course, everyone would say, yeah, of course, yeah, nexus approach. But looking at the mandate of some of the largest aid organizations, and looking at their actual normative policies, and looking at the diversity of their projects and what they're actually doing in the field, the nexus approach would need to be a much broader concept in the real world. And I don't see that yet. I see a lot of humanitarian work. I see a lot of development work. I see a lot of risk financing. I don't see it as this integrated system. But I hope it can be. And just one last thing about the donor perspective. Obviously, it's a strategic decision to allocate money to emergencies that haven't happened yet, particularly in the face of very limited financial resources for emergencies that are already going on. I just checked yesterday, 11% of the UN coordinated plans are currently funded. Financial demand is at 48 billion, and it's only May. The highest financial demand was so far in 23, and it was 56 billion over 12 months. We're at 48 billion over 5, not even 5. So understanding the realities, understanding the limitations, understanding a partly very traditional mindset, and building trust with donors. Again, coming back to the evidence generation is an important part. It's tricky, but there are many success stories and many lessons learned. So there's a lot of progress. I'm very optimistic. Thank you.
Thanks. Does anyone want to jump in that before we close? I think that quote's more relevant than ever, but the lesson I take from the Nexus discussions is that everyone got around the table and said it was important and interesting, but it didn't result in any kind of additional funding or burden relief from humanitarians. I think there's a bit of a risk of the same thing happening with anticipatory action. We need to also think about where the financing comes from outside of humanitarian budgets. Unless anyone else wants to jump in, I'm going to say thanks very much to our panel in the room and online for a really interesting discussion. I'm still learning, and one of the interesting and challenging parts of this work is that it's so diverse and it's taking us in so many directions, and I'm really looking forward to taking it forward and in sort of working out loud and sharing it as we go. In addition to the panel, I'd like to thank Hannah, who's helped us with the tech and the Q&A on line, and Hannah Rijkaard, who I know is online, who helped with the putting together the panel, as well as Yannick standing in the corner, who's leading this work from the H2H side. And I'm sure people would like to chat about the work and do so afterwards. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks everyone online. Great conversation.